Okay, so here we are on our last unit, on our last module, and we're going to talk about what is stigma. Well, stigma, according to Webster's dictionary, is a mark of shame or discredit that is assigned to a person for an action. And this actually can come from yourself. You can place stigma on yourself, from the community, and sadly enough, from healthcare. So what does that look like in the real world? What does stigma look like in the real world? Well, if you think back to that patient that you might have cared for who comes into the hospital on a regular basis with some sort of complaint for pain or is frequently asking for pain medication, think about those words you might hear associated with that patient. As you see these images or videos pop up across social media and on the television and the news showing people who have overdosed, and the impact on the child that's with them, for example, what words come to mind or what words do you hear associated with those situations? And that's an example of stigma in day-to-day life. You might hear things like seeker, loser, worthless, criminal, got what was coming to them. A lot of it was their choice type mentality. Additionally, to understand it, you don't really have to look much further than the nightly news or your social media feed. We have seen over the past few months an outcry, really a public outcry about gun violence or gun control, and I am not negating any of that, so don't misunderstand this statement. I just want to put this into some perspective for you. People are standing up, talking about things we need to do to prevent gun violence. In 2016, 11,000 people were killed because of guns. And in 2016, 63,000 were killed from an overdose. 63,000 compared to 11,000. Does the outcry for each one match the number associated with it? Perhaps even more alarming than 63,000 that was reported in 2016 is the fact that it was a 21% increase in the year before. So not only is it a large number, it is a rapidly growing number, which should be cause for concern. So what we don't see is people hitting the streets trying to get Congress to help with that. What we do see is if you go to your social media feed or you Google it on the internet, you'll see a lot of public outcry to the opposite. Why are we providing Narcan? Why is it that cops carry Narcan versus other drugs? However, to fully understand it, I think we have to take into account what happens when someone suffers from an addiction and is caught with their addiction, and that's they end up in prison. And the Federal Bureau of Prisons reported 50% of their population is there because of a drug-related crime. Now, understand some of those are violent crimes. However, it is a misconception that the majority of them are. In reality, 8% of drug crimes reported by the Federal Bureau of Prisons were violent, only 8%. So 42% of the people locked up in the federal prison system are locked up because they suffer from an addiction and were caught with the drug that caused their problem. So process that for just a minute. Considering all of that information, it should be fairly easy to understand how prevalent stigma is in our society. And it would probably be pretty easy to understand how devastating that might be to someone suffering from the addiction that's placing the stigma on them. The stigma is so great that only 1 in 10 people who suffer from addiction will ask for help or treatment. As long as we have stigma, then life-saving treatment options will not be available to patients who need them. So what do we do to help with the problem? What do we do to help combat stigma and help people get the help that they need? Well, I think the first step is understanding the illness. So let's just think back for a minute to the people we've met throughout these past 2 modules. We met Ben. who was the heroin addict who came from a middle-class family, um, relatively normal life, right? All the other children are successful. They were very loving. Nothing monumental occurred in their life, and he died from a heroin overdose. Then we met the physician in North America whose son passed away from a prescription drug overdose. And then we met Miss USA. And her life was a little different, right? It was a little more sordid childhood. She struggled with a lot of issues throughout her childhood that kind of led her down a certain path. But what do all these people have in common? Well, that's the piece that we really hope that you can see, is that there really is nothing in common. It's not a situation where these people, where we can identify and say this person will suffer, this person won't suffer. It's not a test that we can run. It's no stamp on their head or written warning label that tells us what's underneath. It's not a broken home, privileged home situation. It's not a rich, poor situation. It's not a black-white situation, and it's not a male-female situation. It is a this can happen to anyone situation. And while we don't have all the answers, we are learning more and more every day about the brain and about its role in addiction. Here's what we do know. We do know that there is something that happens in the mind of someone who suffers from addiction. We do know that the dopamine center has been hijacked, for lack of a better word, and the brain now believes the drug to be an essential piece to life, an essential component, just like air, water, food, sex is. The drug has now taken over, and the brain believes it to be. We don't really know why that happens in one person versus another. We just know that it happens. It's important to remember that that happens and that that loss of control has occurred. These people they'll tell you they don't even get high anymore. Once this occurs, it's not about a high, it's about a need for life. It's continuation of life. I was recently at the Opioid and Heroin Summit in Mississippi, and heard this man who was recovering from a cocaine substance abuse disorder talking about the first time he'd done cocaine. He said, and just to put it into perspective for you, I was with about 10 guys, my fraternity brothers. We were all intoxicated, which led us, with our impaired mental state, to try the cocaine in the first place. So they try the cocaine, and the next day they all wake up and they feel terrible. They have these horrible hangovers, and all the guys are like, oh, that's terrible. I'll never do that again. He's like, that's terrible. When can I get it again? He said that very next day he changed his schedule so that he could account for time to be able to get the drug. It was that significant of a switch that had flipped in his mind. One thing we do notice as we look at these case studies and these people that we're watching in these videos is a lot of this began in the preteen, teens type era. And we will also remember, we do know that the brain is not fully formed at this point. That actually doesn't happen till roughly somewhere between 22 to 25 years of age. So these people don't have fully formed brains that we're talking about. And sadly, the most critical piece to our brain, the one that allows us to kind of think as a whole, weigh long-term consequences, control our impulses, it's what controls the executive function of our mind. That's the piece that's the last to form. So it's not a hard concept to grasp that 75% of high school seniors would tell you that they have used some sort of illegal substance by the time they graduate. 75%. So if that's not enough to help you understand the it's their choice, but it's not their choice type situation, consider this thought. These pictures are easily attainable off of the internet. And I don't think that you could show them to anyone who used heroin and that they would argue and say, this is not what life will turn out to be. They know this is the path of heroin. Many of them will tell you there's only two paths to heroin. Someone told me this one time, you either end up in jail or you end up dead. Knowing those two options, they did the heroin anyway. With that thought in mind, what's the mental state of the person who says, yes, that's the life for me? If you answer that question, yes, that's the life for me, are you in a mental state that allows someone else to say to you it was your choice to take the drug in the first place? Dr. Norris summed this up with this quote: "In all my years as a physician, I have never ever met an addicted person who wanted to be an addict." The good news is there are things you can do to change this narrative, starting with compassion. So having compassion for people who are suffering, knowledge of what it is, what it means to be addicted. And again, this is a growing science. So you need to understand that this is going to change every year. So you have to continue to re-educate yourself on these topics. But knowledge of it and knowledge of recognition of the problem. Once we recognize the problem, we then ultimately have to be able to get the people the help they need. So once I know that there's a problem, then I need to know about referral resources that are available to me so that I can help the patient get to where they need to go. Additionally, you can literally change the narrative. You can change the words that are being utilized. We need to start avoiding terms that label or stigmatize the disease and move to terms that help make it more aware that it is the illness that it is. And that's what this chart, I like this chart because the chart actually gives you specific examples and why they are offensive or why they're terms that we should be changing. So you can change your terminology, but you can also help educate others who need assistance with the change in terminology. So that concludes the stigma presentation. You should at this point understand what stigma is. You should have a good indication of the negative impact of stigma. You should also understand what you personally can do to fight it. One, understanding addiction and sharing your knowledge. And two, changing the narrative.